Pastor Justin, and today we're going outside to look at something that's really interesting, a connection between Ephesians and Genesis. We've been going through Ephesians in our Sunday morning sermon series, and one verse we didn't really look hard at, but I wanted to bring your attention was Ephesians 1:11. This is one of the best verses in the Bible when it comes to talking about the sovereignty of God, that God is in control of all things. And this is what Ephesians 1:11 says. In him we were also chosen, having been predestined according to the plan of him who works out everything in conformity with the purpose of his will. That God has a plan and he works out everything in conformity with the purpose of his will. That's a great definition of sovereignty. That God doesn't just work some things out and everything else was a mistake or was an accident, but even the bad stuff, the good stuff, the bad stuff, the stuff that makes sense, the stuff that doesn't make sense, God takes it all and he works it out in conformity with his will. That every single thing that happens in this world is for the purpose of God. That's kind of that's both a very comforting thing to know that nothing is random, nothing's left to chance, that we have a sovereign God who is above all, around all, through all. But it can be a huge challenge, especially when we look at the sin in the world, when we look at the pain, the suffering, the struggles, the corruptions, things that just make us cry at night. There's a lot to struggle with, and we go, how can God use that? Why doesn't God use His sovereignty to make sure those things don't happen? It's a huge question, and it's not something we really have a lot of time to go into today. But I want us to get a sense of God's sovereignty, and a sense, even if we can't fully understand it, of why this is important. And for that, we're going to go back to Genesis chapter 45. And this is probably the single largest story in the Bible, single continuous story of the story of Joseph. You're probably very well aware of it. But in the story, of course, if you haven't read it or you need a brief recap, Joseph, he's a favorite of his father, Jacob. Jacob gives him that coat of many colors, and Joseph has dreams that his brothers will all bow down to him. They're not too happy about it. So they basically kidnap Joseph, throw him down a well, take his coat, tear it, cover it with blood, tell their dad that Joseph died. He was torn apart by wild animals, and they almost kill Joseph. But instead, at the last moment, they decide, there's a slave caravan coming through. Let's sell him to there instead. So Joseph goes from being part of his family, being doted on by his father, to becoming a slave. And he's taken to Egypt. And there things kind of seems like they're going up. He works really hard at Potiphar's household. He's esteemed. He's put in charge of things. But then he's falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, and he's thrown into prison. And at that point, he's just probably the lowest he's ever been in his life. He's a slave. He's a prisoner. He's yanked away from his family, and he's there for years. And I think that's something that's easy to ignore because it's just a little bit of a verse here where Joseph's in prison for many years before finally the visions that Pharaoh had are interpreted correctly by Joseph with God's power, and Joseph rises to power in Egypt, and he becomes basically the number two in Egypt. And we're getting to this passage. Just follow me here. So the long story short is that Joseph's brothers end up coming to Egypt because there's a huge famine in the land, and Egypt's a place that has all the food because Joseph's correctly interpreted these dreams of Pharaoh that there's going to be a famine, so they start storing up all this food. So Joseph's family comes in, and there's a long back and forth where, Joseph doesn't reveal who he is at first, and, he sends them away with some food, and they come back, and he's like, bring back my brother, but he doesn't say brother, bring back, the youngest child. But finally, in chapter 45, he makes himself known. He just can't contain himself. He's at the point of tears, it says. And in verse 3, Joseph says this, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. His brothers think, man, we did the worst thing in the world to this man, and now he's in total power over us. We're all dead men. That's exactly what they were thinking. We're going to die or something worse. Verse 4, Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done that, he said, "I am your brother, the one you sold into Egypt. But now do not be distressed. Do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." And then he goes ahead in verse 7. It says, "God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, to save your lives by a great deliverance." And verse 8. "So then it was not you who sent me here, but God." We're starting to get a sense of God's sovereignty, that God is in control of all things. In the center of it, and among that sovereignty, God allows us some measure of human freedom and will. We do have the boys here, Jacob's boys, had the freedom to do a right or wrong thing in terms of how they treated Joseph, and they chose the wrong thing. They chose an evil, an objectively, subjectively evil thing to do to Joseph. But Joseph says, "You know what? You guys send me here. You sold me into slavery, but it was really God who did it. God still ordained that action, that sinful action. God allowed to happen because God was going to work through it." And there's a very important verse that I think is probably much more well known from Genesis 50, because Joseph has to keep reassuring his brothers, saying, "I'm not going to kill you. I'm not going to take revenge." And they say this in Genesis 50, verse 15. "When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, 'What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did toward him?'" Verse 19. "But Joseph said to them, 'Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God?'" He's basically saying, "Am I your judge? I'm not your judge." Verse 20. Memorize Genesis 50, verse 20. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now done, the saving of many lives." So we see two intents, two purposes, two wills. The wills of the men. They willed something evil. They wanted to harm Joseph. And that was their will. They acted within their free will. They acted within the freedom that God gave them. But above and around all of that was God's will, God's sovereignty. And Joseph says, you guys may think that you really were acting on your own, but God already from the beginning of time was planning to use this evil event for a good thing, for his good will, to save many lives. And this is really, this action, this whole story of Joseph preserves the lineage of Abraham, preserves this family that becomes the family of Israel, the nation of Israel, and eventually leads to Jesus Christ. And so God is working, 100,000 steps ahead of everybody else. Doesn't mean we can explain away everything. When somebody comes to you and says, "Why does so-and-so die? Why am I suffering? Why does this horrible thing happen in the world?" I can't answer for God. I can't say I can explain every little thing. But we can look at the story of Joseph, and we can, I think, derive a lot of great comfort from it, from seeing that at no point was any of these evils that the brothers perpetuated against Joseph outside of God's sovereignty. And we see that God used these evil things for a great good. And I think that actually provides us a lot of comfort in our lives when we're going through suffering. And we go, well, do I really want that suffering to be random, to be meaningless? Or do I want to believe the words of the Bible that says even suffering God can use for his purpose, his will, and to do something great, and that there will be a day when I'm in heaven that God says, let me show you, let me open up a new book, a new Bible. Let me show you how I used that evil, that terrible suffering in your life, and I did something good with it. That's just getting a sense of God's sovereignty. Doesn't mean we can't struggle with it. Doesn't mean it's not hard to sense. Doesn't mean it won't like pit you against the Bible and go, it really gets me angry to think about that. But in the end, do we want to believe that all of this is random, or that everything is inside of God's will? Even the horrible things, even a man who was put on a cross to die for our sins, an objectively evil act done for good to save many lives. Go in peace. Have a great day.